Unmasking the Devil, the sinister story of the White City. Have you ever wondered what it's like to be lost in a place where escape is impossible? A place where the darkness isn't just around you, but inside you. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next will leave you questioning reality itself. Don't blink. You may not be ready for what's lurking in the shadows. The hallway was cold. The air thick with dust. Faint, distant sounds echoed. Footsteps. A whisper. A creak of wood. He didn't know where he was. It had been hours, maybe days. Time had lost its grip. The walls seemed to close in. His hand brushed against the peeling paint. The texture rough, jagged. He wiped his palm, but the grit lingered. A shiver ran down his spine. The flickering light above him buzzed. One of the bulbs hanging by a thread. A faint hum. Then silence. His breath quickened. He glanced over his shoulder. Nothing. Just the dark hallway, stretching endlessly in both directions. He wasn't sure what he was running from anymore. But he had to keep moving. There was something out there. Something in the dark. He could feel it. The hairs on his neck stood up. His feet shuffled faster now. Each step echoing too loudly. Too clearly. His pulse pounded in his ears. Was he being followed? A faint rustle in the corner of his vision. He spun around. Empty. Just the empty hallway. The dark, suffocating hallway. Then a sound. Soft at first. A breath. A whisper. It was coming from behind. Slow, deliberate. A voice. He couldn't make out the words. It didn't matter. He knew what it meant. He wasn't alone. He could feel the eyes on him. The hairs on his arms stood on end. The air turned thick. The temperature dropped. A cold that seeped into his bones. He didn't dare look back. He just kept running. The footsteps. Getting closer. A dark shape moved in the corner of his eye. Something just out of reach. He sprinted harder. The sound of his own breath was deafening now. A door ahead. Just ahead. A way out. His heart hammered. He reached for the handle. His fingers brushed it. It twisted. The door opened. Darkness. Complete and utter blackness. He stepped forward. The air was thick with something foul. A heavy breath. A presence in the room. But no light. Nothing but the suffocating blackness. The door slammed shut behind him. His heart raced. Pulse thundering in his ears. He stood in the dark, frozen. The stench of decay filled his nostrils. The air tasted wrong. Every sense on high alert. His feet were rooted to the floor. His mind screamed at him to move. But he couldn't. A sound faint, but growing louder. A scraping. Like nails dragging across stone. It came from the corner. It was close. Too close. A breath. Cold, unnatural. He felt it against his skin. His throat tightened. He wanted to scream, but his voice wouldn't come. Another scrape. This time closer. More deliberate. The darkness around him seemed to shift. To tighten. A figure, slowly, silently, emerged from the shadows. The shape was tall, unnaturally so. Its form distorted, twisted. He couldn't make out its face. But he could feel its eyes. Burning into him. His legs trembled. He could feel the walls closing in. Trapping him. The scraping stopped. Only the silence remained. Heavy. Thick. Then, a low, guttural whisper. I see you. The words slithered through the air. Cold. Hollow. It reached for him. A cold hand brushed his cheek. Frozen. His breath caught in his throat. A burst of panic surged through him. The door. He had to get to the door. He turned, stumbling. But it wasn't there anymore. The room had changed. The walls had shifted. Now it was a corridor. A maze. The figure's presence was behind him. Closer now. The scraping noise returned. Closer. He ran. Faster this time. His feet slapped against the ground. The sound of his own panic deafening. But the figure kept pace. Always just behind. A breath. A cold breath against his neck. He darted down another hallway. A sharp turn. But the darkness was everywhere. It swallowed him whole. He stumbled forward blindly. The walls closed in tighter. Each step was harder than the last. His chest burned. His legs screamed for rest. But the sound. The scraping, slow and deliberate. It was right behind him. He couldn't outrun it. He couldn't escape. The corridor seemed endless. A maze with no exit. Every turn led him deeper into the dark. No light. No way out. His mind raced. He needed a way to fight back. To stop it. But all he had were his fists. He turned to face the darkness. The figure loomed. It was tall, impossibly tall. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long. The air around him grew colder. The breath on his neck was ice. It moved closer. A blur in the dark. Its features were still too distorted to see. But he could feel its presence. Every inch of it. He reached out. His hand trembling. Then, a flash of light. A moment of clarity. The light flickered. The figure froze. Just for a moment. He didn't hesitate. He ran. His legs burning. His heart hammering. He didn't care where he was going. Only that he needed to get away. Another turn. Another hallway. And then. A door. A real door. His hand flew to the handle. It twisted open with ease. He didn't look back. He didn't stop. He pushed through the door, slamming it shut behind him. Silence. He stood there, breathing heavily. His skin was cold. His mind was foggy. Where was he? What was this place? He glanced around. The room was bare. Empty. No signs of the figure. No sound. Just the heavy, oppressive quiet. The door behind him trembled. A low vibration. Then, the scraping. Closer. But this time, he wasn't alone. The vibration grew stronger. The scraping louder. He spun around. The door was trembling violently now. A sharp crack echoed through the room. A splintering sound. The door buckled. Someone, was on the other side. He backed away. His heart pounded, his breath shallow. His eyes darted across the room. There was nowhere to hide. The walls were bare. The corners empty. But the door was giving way. The first crack splintered wide. A hand pushed through. Long fingers, gnarled and pale. Fingers that seemed to stretch forever. It pulled with a terrifying force. The door splintered further. The scraping sound was unbearable now. It raked against his eardrums. His eyes locked onto the hand. His legs moved before his mind could catch up. He ran again. But there was no escape. No way out. The hand was followed by an arm. A twisted, grotesque limb. Then a face. A face that wasn't human. But something worse. It grinned at him. A smile stretched impossibly wide. The figure lurched forward. Its movements jerky, unnatural. He ran faster. But the walls closed in again. He felt them pressing against him. Crushing him. The figure followed, always just behind. Then, a low whisper. A voice. "I'm not finished with you." The words slid into his brain. Cold, vile. A flash of panic. A surge of adrenaline. He ran. But it didn't matter. The walls were closing. The room was shrinking. There was no exit. The scraping sound stopped. The whispering voice faded. But the darkness still surrounded him. The air thickened, suffocating. His lungs burned with every breath. The walls kept pressing in. Crushing him, tightening around him. The light, what little light there was, flickered again. A brief, haunting flash. Then, the silence. The unsettling silence. It felt as if time had stopped. Everything hung in a heavy pause. But he couldn't move. He couldn't think. Then, the whisper returned. Faint at first, like a distant echo. I know where you are. The voice slithered through the air. Too close. Too real. His heart pounded in his chest. His legs felt like lead. His eyes darted around, frantic. Searching for an escape. There was nothing. Nothing but endless darkness. The pressure on his chest increased. Like the room was alive. Like it was breathing with him. A shadow shifted at the far end of the room. A flicker in the dark. It wasn't the figure. Not yet. But something was coming. Something worse. He heard the scraping again. Closer now. But this time, it was no longer just a sound. It was in the air. The cold. The chill that cut through his skin. He could feel it crawling up his spine. A presence. The darkness thickened. He couldn't see. Only the sensation of something behind him. Something that wasn't human. The floor beneath him began to tremble. Shaking, pulsing, alive. He stumbled back. His legs buckled. The walls were moving again. Closing in. The whispers grew louder. Now they were words. Don't run. You can't hide. A flash of light, a sharp glare. But it wasn't light. It was eyes. Thousands of them. Flickering in the dark. Staring at him. Watching. The scraping stopped. A moment of pure, suffocating silence. Then the figure emerged. Its face now clear. It wasn't human. It was something worse. The smile twisted. The teeth sharp. It took a step forward. Its eyes never leaving his. I told you, it whispered. You can't escape. The air grew colder still. The figure moved closer. Its long, gnarled fingers reached out. It dragged its nails across the floor. The scraping sound was deafening now. Each drag of its claws like a knife through bone. His legs shook. He couldn't move. The darkness pressed in. The walls felt like they were squeezing him. The figure was only a few feet away. Its breath icy and heavy. He could feel it. The weight of its presence. The eyes, thousands of them, blinked in unison. They followed his every movement. He wanted to scream. But his throat was frozen. The figure's smile widened. Its teeth gleaming in the dark. You're mine now, it whispered. The words slithered into his mind. Cold, venomous. It reached for him. Its fingers curling like claws. He could feel the cold against his skin. A chill that burned. But something inside him snapped. Adrenaline surged. He forced his legs to move. He darted to the side. His body crashing against the wall. The figure reached out. Fingers brushing the air where he'd just been. His breath came in ragged gasps. He couldn't think. He had to move. The floor beneath him groaned. It trembled. The room was shifting again. The walls closing in. There was no way out. The figure took another step. Its grin stretched even wider. The eyes were everywhere now. He backed away. But his body was frozen. The walls were too close. Too tight. And then, a voice. A soft whisper from behind. Run! He didn't question it. He didn't hesitate. He turned and ran. His feet barely touching the floor. The darkness pressed down on him. The walls closing in fast. But the whisper urged him on. Faster, faster. He sprinted down the hallway. It stretched on forever. The scraping sound grew louder. Closer. The figure was behind him. He could feel it. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. The floor beneath him shifted. It felt unstable, like it was alive. His feet stumbled. He barely caught his balance. But he kept running. He had to. The whisper in his ear grew louder. Don't look back. He clenched his jaw. His heart hammered in his chest. The walls were moving again. The room was warping around him. The air was thick, suffocating. Every breath was harder than the last. He glanced to his side. Just for a moment. A flash of movement. A figure, too fast to see clearly. His pulse shot through the roof. He pushed harder, faster. The hallway stretched on. It seemed endless. The scraping came again. Closer. He could hear its breath now. Cold, chilling, like death itself. He didn't dare turn around. But he could feel its eyes on him. The walls were closing in. The hallway narrowing. A door. A door ahead. He reached for it. His fingers brushed the handle. It twisted. It opened. He stepped through. Into another room. The walls were bare. The floor was smooth. But the air was still. Too still. Something wasn't right. The door slammed shut behind him. A heavy thud that made the room shake. His pulse quickened. The silence was too thick. Then, from the corner, a soft voice. "Welcome." He froze. The voice was too familiar. His stomach dropped. The figure was in the room. He couldn't see it. But he could feel it. The eyes were everywhere again. Watching, waiting. He turned. Heart racing, blood pumping. A shape emerged from the shadows. Slowly. A smile stretched wide across its face. The same twisted, jagged grin. He backed away. But the figure followed. The door. The door was gone. There was no escape. The figure's laughter echoed. Low, chilling. And in that moment, he knew it had won. The air grew thicker. He could barely breathe. The figure took another step forward. Closer. Its shadow stretched long across the floor. It swallowed the light. His back hit the wall. There was nowhere else to go. The figure's smile never wavered. It was just a mask of pure malice. "I told you," it whispered. "You can't escape me." Its fingers twitched. Sharp nails scraping against the floor. His chest heaved. Panic clawed at his throat. The walls felt like they were closing in again. Slowly. Relentlessly. He could hear the scraping now. All around him. It wasn't just one sound. It was everywhere. He pressed himself into the corner. His eyes darting, searching. The figure was too close. He could feel the cold radiating from it. The eyes. So many eyes. Watching him. Staring. The room seemed to stretch in unnatural ways. The corners bending. His heart was racing. His thoughts scrambled. There was no way out. He had to think. Then, a flicker. A tiny shift in the dark. The figure paused. It noticed. A brief flash of light. Just a glimmer. It was an opening. In a desperate rush, he lunged toward it. The figure didn't move at first. It just watched. But the laughter returned. Low and hollow. The darkness seemed to ripple. The light was fading. He pushed forward. No time to think. His hands grabbed at the shadow. It wasn't solid. He was slipping through. Falling. The cold was unbearable. It clung to his skin. He hit the ground. Hard. But it wasn't over. He could hear the scraping. Coming closer. The darkness followed him. It never stopped. And as he looked around, he realized with terror. The walls weren't walls at all. They were the figure. It had consumed the space. It had always been here. His breath caught in his throat. The realization hit him like a wave. The figure wasn't just following him. It was the space. The walls, the floor, the air. It was all part of it. He scrambled to his feet. But there was nowhere to run. The dark corners twisted, reaching toward him. Every step he took. The darkness seemed to crawl faster. The air grew colder, heavier. It was as if it was pulling him in. His pulse hammered in his chest. His legs shaking beneath him. He couldn't breathe. Couldn't move. A low, guttural growl echoed from the walls. The figure was speaking without words. And then, the light flickered. A momentary flash of clarity. He saw it. The figure. More distinct now. Its twisted face. The hollow, empty eyes. It smiled. A smile too wide. Too sharp. "I told you," it whispered again. "You are mine." The room seemed to pulse, vibrating with its every word. The walls around him closed in. Tighter and tighter. His chest was crushed under the weight of it. The air thick and suffocating. He pressed his hands against the walls. Tried to push back. But they gave way like flesh. Sinking under his touch. The scraping sound grew louder. More frantic. It was everywhere. In his ears. His skin crawled. His heart raced. He could feel its presence closing in. It was too late to escape. The darkness surged forward, wrapping around him. And then everything stopped. For a moment there was silence. Utter silence. And in that silence, he could feel the weight of its eyes. Watching. Waiting. And then, a single whisper. "You will never leave." The words echoed in his mind. But they didn't stop. They clawed at him, scraping at his sanity. The room was no longer a room. It was a living thing. The walls seemed to breathe. Inhale and exhale with him. He pressed his palms against his ears, desperate to block out the whisper. But it didn't help. The voice was inside his head now. "You will never leave," it repeated. Closer. Closer. The floor beneath him trembled. Shaking violently. He stumbled back. But his legs were giving out. The air turned freezing. A biting cold that froze him to the bone. The scraping resumed. Slow. Torturous. He turned his head, frantically searching for some escape. But there was nothing. Only darkness. And then the figure. It emerged from the shadows again, looming over him. Its face was grotesque. Twisted, deformed. Its eyes locked with his. No escape. It smiled again. That same smile. Sharp, jagged teeth. But this time, the smile widened even further. The room around him shifted, morphing into something worse. A dark, endless void. There was no floor. No ceiling. No walls. Just that darkness. Closing in. And the figure. It reached out for him. Long fingers stretching impossibly far. The cold was unbearable now. It burned. His body began to freeze. Frost creeping up his limbs. And as the figure's hand grasped his arm, he felt his breath leave him. The darkness surged forward. And he was pulled into it. A scream escaped him. But it was swallowed whole. Nothing. Nothing but silence. And in the dark, the voice whispered again. "You are mine." The voice lingered in the void, its cold words pressing against his soul. He couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. His body was frozen, weightless in the blackness. Every inch of him felt like stone. Like the very essence of life had been stripped away. The cold seeped deeper, until it felt like he was being consumed. The silence stretched. But it wasn't empty. It was full of something. A presence. Heavy and suffocating. He felt it all around him. Closing in. The walls weren't walls. The space wasn't empty. It was waiting. The eyes returned. Hundreds, thousands. Watching him. The whispers came again. Soft at first, then louder. "You can't escape." The words gnawed at him, scraping against his mind. His head spun, his thoughts unraveling. And then, a shift. A movement in the dark. A shape. A familiar shape. The figure was back. But this time, it wasn't alone. There were others. More figures. Shadows that seemed to bleed into the dark. Creeping closer. He tried to scream. But his voice wouldn't come. His body was still. Paralyzed. The figures hovered around him. Closing in. Circling. One of them reached out, its long fingers grazing his cheek. Cold. Frozen. The touch burned him. The others joined in, their hands wrapping around him. But there was no escape. They were everywhere. Their eyes, those countless eyes, piercing him. And the voice. It came again, louder this time. You are part of this now. The figures pulled him into the dark, pulling him deeper, until there was nothing left of him but the silence. The eternal silence. And the darkness consumed him. The darkness settled like a weight, pressing down on everything. No sound. No light. Only the weight of his existence. Now part of the void. He couldn't feel his body. Couldn't move. But he was still there. Somewhere. In the deep, unyielding black. Time lost meaning. It stretched. Twisted. As if it no longer mattered. The cold was endless. It seeped into his very soul. And then, something stirred. A distant sound. A soft scrape. It was faint at first. Almost a memory. But it grew. Closer. He could feel it. That scraping against the dark. Closer. He tried to move. To break free. But his body remained frozen. Paralyzed in the blackness. The scrape grew louder. Sharp, relentless. A presence was near. Closer now. The figure. It was here again. But it wasn't alone. Others. More. They circled him in the dark. Fingers just brushing against his skin. A sudden chill. Colder than before. Seeped into him. His chest tightened. He tried to scream. But nothing came. The cold gripped tighter. Stronger. You belong to us now, the voice said. It was inside him. Curling around his thoughts. The scraping. It was everywhere. All around him. He felt it beneath his skin. Crawling under his flesh. The dark consumed him. Filling his every sense. And just when he thought he couldn't bear it, there was a shift. A breaking. A crack in the void. A sliver of light. Barely visible. He reached for it. But the darkness pulled him back. Dragging him deeper. He fought. Fought against the cold. The weight. The shadows. But the light slipped away. And the silence returned. He was lost again. Fading. Consumed by the dark. The cold pressed harder. Sinking deeper into him. His thoughts were fragments. Shattered pieces in the void. He was no longer sure where he ended and the darkness began. It was all one. A singular, endless void. The scraping returned. Closer now. More insistent. It tore at his senses. A sound that made his skin crawl. But there was no escape. No place to hide. Then a pulse. A beat of something. A flash of memory. A door. Was it real? He couldn't remember. It felt like a dream. A distant fragment of something lost. But the pulse kept beating. Faint but steady. Pulling him. He reached for it. Not sure if he had the strength. But his hands moved. His feet followed. Slowly. Against the crushing weight of the dark. The scraping stopped. Silence. And then. A whisper. Not yet. The voice was so close. It felt like it was inside him. He froze. Couldn't move. His heart thundered in his chest. Then a sound, a step. Something shifted in the dark. The space felt larger. The pressure lightened. A momentary relief. His eyes strained against the black. But he couldn't see. Was it the figure again? Or something worse? The beat pulsed again. Closer now. He could almost feel it. He took a step. One step. And then. Something tugged at him. He jerked back. But it wasn't the darkness. It was something else. Something cold. Sharp. He turned. A flash of movement. A shadow. A hand. It reached for him. But this time, he could see it. The hand was his own. The hand reached out. Long, trembling fingers. But it wasn't his. He gasped. His breath shallow. His chest tight. The fingers were his. But they weren't his. They moved without him. Gripping the air. Twisting in unnatural angles. His own body was betraying him. A sickening feeling crawled up his throat. A sense of losing control. He looked down. But there was no body. Only the dark. The void. The hand twisted again. A grotesque, jerking motion. It was pulling him. He tried to scream. To fight. But his voice was lost in the darkness. The hand curled tighter. The darkness tightened around him. Then the whisper. It slithered through the air. Cutting through his thoughts. You are mine! It was so close. The air chilled even further. His skin felt like ice. But his own hand. It was pulling him in. Dragging him deeper. The void stretched again. A never-ending abyss. But this time, the pull wasn't the darkness. It was something else. Something familiar. A tug on his soul. The figure's face flashed in his mind. The grin? Sharp teeth. But this time, he could feel something different. A thin thread of resistance. It was him. He could feel it. His own will. It was weak. But it was there. He focused. Summoning every last ounce of strength. His hand trembled. Fighting the pull. And then, with a scream that he couldn't hear, he pushed. The darkness recoiled. A crack of light. A fleeting glimpse of something outside. He tried to reach for it. His fingers brushing against it. But the dark pulled back. Dragging him again. Pulling him to the depths. The light flickered. It was so close. And then, nothing. The darkness consumed him whole. The darkness wrapped around him like a suffocating blanket. Tightening with every passing second. The light. It was gone. There was nothing but cold. A cold that burrowed deep into his bones. His senses dulled. His mind slipping further away. The pull was relentless. Dragging him deeper into the void. But somewhere, in the deepest part of his mind, a spark of defiance remained. He couldn't let go. He couldn't let it win. A whisper stirred the air again. Familiar, sinister. You are mine! The words gnawed at his thoughts. Clawing through the remnants of his will. But he focused. He reached deep inside. Something, anything. To hold on to. The pressure on his chest grew heavier. The void tightening its grip. Then, a sudden shift. A flash of light. Brief but sharp. For a moment, he felt something other than the crushing darkness. A fragment of hope. But the darkness recoiled. The scraping returned. Closer. It wasn't just the figure anymore. It was everywhere. The walls, the air. The very space around him. Alive. He couldn't breathe. Couldn't escape. A pulse of cold hit him again. Sinking deeper into his core. Then, the laughter. Low, guttural, and endless. It echoed through his soul. Around him. He tried to scream. But the sound was swallowed whole. The darkness had him now. No escape. No escape from the cold. The whispers? The eyes. He was part of it. He could feel it. The last remnants of his self. Pulled into the abyss. And in the end, there was nothing. Only silence. The silence was deafening. It was no longer empty. No longer a void. The pressure lifted. But not in the way he expected. It was as if the dark had taken on a shape. A presence of its own. Shifting and pulsating around him. He was aware of himself. But not really. A faint hum filled the space. Vibrating through his mind. His thoughts were fragmented. Shifting like pieces of a puzzle that couldn't fit. Then a flash. Brief but sharp. The figure. It was here. It was always here. The cold returned. But now it was unbearable. A freezing grip around his chest. And that voice. Whispering, always whispering. You thought you could escape. It echoed. Deep in his soul. He felt something stir in the darkness. A movement. Something. Someone. Was coming closer. The scraping grew louder. Closer still. He tried to back away. But there was nowhere to go. Nothing to hide behind. The laughter echoed again, filling the space around him. Through his mind. It grew more frantic. More desperate. Run, little one! It whispered. But there was no escape. The figure loomed larger now. He couldn't look away. His legs trembled. His body frozen in place. A thin, cold tendril wrapped around him. It dragged him forward. Closer to the figure. Closer to the eyes. The eyes? Too many. They were watching him. They always had been. And as the figure reached out, its hands stretching for his face, a blinding light pierced the darkness. But it was not an escape. It was a trap. The light burned his eyes, sharp and searing, blinding him for a moment. He tried to shield himself. But it was everywhere, filling the space. And then, it flickered. For a split second, everything went black again. But the presence remained. Like an echo. The scraping returned. Deeper this time. He could feel it. Vibrating through the floor. The walls. His very bones. And in the stillness that followed, the whisper came again. You can't hide from me. The words slithered into his mind, wrapping around his thoughts. He could feel the figure closing in. Its breath cold against his neck. It was there. It had always been there. The light flickered again. Fainter this time. A sound. A groan. As if the space itself were in pain. He tried to move. But his limbs felt like lead. Paralyzed by the weight of it. He could hear the figures shifting. Circling him. The cold pressed in. Closer, tighter. A sharp pain shot through his chest. A cold, jagged needle through his ribs. He gasped. It felt like he was being torn apart. Bit by bit. The voice returned. Low and guttural. You are mine now. There is no escape. He could feel it. The figure's hands on him. Cold and unyielding. It gripped tighter. Dragging him down. He wanted to scream. But the words were trapped inside. Frozen in his throat. And then, a sudden jolt. He was falling. Falling deeper. The darkness wrapped around him. Tighter. Pulling him down faster. Dragging him toward the void. And as he fell, he realized there was no bottom. No end. Just the endless descent. The fall stretched on forever. The void swallowing him whole. The air was thick now. Heavier with each second. It felt like his lungs were being crushed. His chest tightening with the pressure. The cold was unbearable. Seeping into his very soul. Burning and freezing at once. The darkness was all around him. Pressing in. Pushing him deeper. He couldn't move. Couldn't escape. His thoughts were muddled. Shattered pieces of who he once was. The silence was absolute. But it wasn't empty. The whisper came again. Closer now. You're mine. It wasn't just a figure anymore. It was something far worse. The darkness wasn't just a space. It was alive. A living, breathing entity. Wrapping itself around him. And then, without warning, the scraping returned. Deafening. It was everywhere. Closer. So close that it felt like it was inside him. His teeth rattled. His skin crawled. He could feel the darkness pressing against him. Pushing into him. The voices. Whispers, moans, laughter. They echoed through the black. You can't escape me. The pressure grew. His thoughts fractured. The walls were moving again, closing in on him. But there was no escape. No way out. The scraping, the laughing, the cold. They surrounded him, overwhelming his senses. And then, a single word. Welcome. It was all-encompassing. It filled the space, shaping the very dark around him. And as the pressure crushed him, he realized with horror. There was no return. The void had claimed him. The darkness was now part of him. He was lost. And he would never be found. The darkness around him twisted, as though it had a life of its own. His limbs were numb, frozen in place. He couldn't feel his body anymore. Couldn't tell where the void ended and he began. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing down on him from all sides. But even in the suffocating dark, there was movement. Something stirred. The scraping noise, the sound of claws against stone, was closer now. It scraped against his mind, scratching at his thoughts. The void was alive. And it was hungry. He tried to move, to fight. But his body was no longer his own. The pressure grew, crushing him, crushing everything inside him. And then, from the depths, a whisper. You thought you could run. It wasn't a voice. It was an echo. A presence, filling the space around him. The cold pressed in. The darkness wrapped tighter. He was being pulled somewhere deeper, further into the abyss. There was no escape. Not anymore. The whisper came again. This time louder. Closer. You are mine. He felt it. The presence. Closing in on him. Consuming him. Becoming a part of him. His heart raced. But there was no heartbeat left. His thoughts scattered. Shattered. Slipping through his fingers like sand. And then, the scraping stopped. The laughter faded. The cold remained. But there was something else now. A faint, flickering light. At first, it was small. A barely noticeable shimmer in the dark. It pulsed. Faintly. He reached for it. He could almost touch it. The void fought back, pulling him away. But the light persisted. For the first time in what felt like forever. He felt warmth. The light surged, blindingly bright, piercing the darkness. The void recoiled. And then, in a single moment, he was free. But the light faded too quickly, slipping from his grasp. And as the darkness rushed back in, he realized the light was just another illusion. A trap. The light faded as quickly as it had appeared, dissolving into the overwhelming blackness. He was left in the suffocating quiet once again, the weight of the void pressing against his chest. The cold was unbearable. But it wasn't just the chill that made him feel empty. It was the sense of loss. The light, the hope, had been fleeting. A brief flash in a world that had no place for it. The scraping, the laughter. They were gone now. And for a moment, there was only silence. Deep, absolute silence. The pressure around him began to ease. The darkness, once suffocating, began to settle. He couldn't feel his body anymore. But it didn't matter. There was nothing to fight. Nothing to resist. He was still here. But he was no longer him. In this place, he had become something else. A part of the dark. Part of the endless silence. It was as if the void had claimed him entirely. Not in a violent, consuming way, but in a quiet acceptance. There was peace here. Not the peace he had hoped for. Not the freedom he had fought for. But a stillness that was beyond struggle. And in that stillness, he could hear the faintest echo of his own thoughts. Growing distant. Fading like whispers in the wind. It was no longer his voice. It was something else. Something deeper. The dark had no end. It was endless. Timeless. But in its depths, He had found an odd tranquility. Not an escape, but an acceptance. He was part of it now. And as the last remnants of his awareness slipped away, he realized there was no fear here. No pain. Only quiet. The void had claimed him. And he had found peace. Finally.